Welcome to Seminars at Steamboat. I'm Joella West, Seminars Chair. Today we mark the halfway point in our 7-event season. We've covered a lot of ground so far, and now we turn to a subject that really should be of constant concern to all of us, but often gets pushed to the 21st century version of the back pages, kind of where we used to find public health. As always, we present a nonpartisan talk by an expert in the area, and we encourage you to participate in the Q&A immediately following the talk. It's easy to ask a question. Just click on the chat, which appears at the bottom of your page. Although you're watching on our webpage, the chat works exactly like Zoom. We hope you've already discovered that there are other interesting things to be found on our website. Of course, there's information about all of this season's speakers and topics, and you can view past events from this season as well as many from recent years, which are worth spending a little time reviewing, not just for historical interest, but for perspective on many subjects that are still top of mind. We'll post today's talk later this week, and it will be captioned, as are all of our recorded events this season. And while you're on our website tonight, or really anytime, please consider making a contribution to support our continuing mission to bring high-level policy discussions free to the public. You'll find the donate button at the top of your screen. We're also on Facebook and Instagram, and KUNC, Community Radio of Northern Colorado, makes this season's talks available on their website, kunc.org's Seminars Podcast landing page. Special thanks to today's sponsors, Bell Sawhill and Yampa Valley Bank. Following the conclusion of tonight's event, we'll be presenting our final Virtual Friends dinner on Zoom. If you signed up for it, please remember to join promptly at 6:45 Mountain Daylight Time by using the link that you received earlier. Going forward, the rest of this year's presentations will be extended to allow for additional audience questions. And we hope to be back in person next year with Friends dinners featuring virtual, not virtual, actual food. Our speaker today is Maya MacGuineas, and here to introduce her is board member Ken Spruill.
Good evening. We are very fortunate to be joined tonight by Maya MacGuineas. Maya is one of our country's leading independent experts on our country's financial situation. And she spent the past several decades on a crusade, seeking out and recommending bipartisan ways in which we can run our country in a more fiscally responsible or more fiscally sane manner. During her career, Maya has worked in both Washington and on Wall Street, and since 2003 has served as president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. It has been during this time that she has raised the awareness of our country's ever-increasing deficits, our levels of national debt, our budgeting processes, or at times lack of budgeting processes, and the absence of political will to really address some of these long-term fiscal challenges. Fiscal challenges that appear to have only become more pressing over the past 18 months of the pandemic. As Joel mentioned, and as is typical for the seminars this season, if at any time you'd like to send in a question to Maya for the Q&A, you can do so with that chat box just below the live stream video that you're watching, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A. Also, as is typical for this season, while we wish, of course, that we could be in person all together and that Maya could be here in Steamboat presenting to us live, we do have the next best thing, and she has a very busy schedule right now, and we do appreciate Maya taking the time to join us and speak to us virtually. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Maya MacGuineas to speak to us on fiscal sanity in an insane world.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you, Joella. Thank you. And I do want to thank my good friend, Bell Sawhill, for inviting me to this. And I do not think being remote is anywhere close to the next best thing. I have heard time and time again how absolutely beautiful it is out there. And I am ready to move and get out of this house. At least I thought I was going to be doing this from a small family vacation, but I am still at home. So sad not to be there, but really excited about this group. It sounds like a terrific group from what I've heard. And I know you have a great lineup of speakers who've been with you before. Here's what I'm going to do. I always much prefer the discussion part than the than the remarks part, since I've heard them all before, and I'd much rather hear how people are thinking about this issue. And I know it's a really informed group. I'm going to touch upon, I think I'll talk just for a minute about what our organization does, because I think it's kind of an interesting focus in Washington, and we've changed the way we worked over the years. I'll talk about our fiscal situation, a little bit about why it matters. I think one of the biggest challenges on budget policy and fiscal policy is actually getting people to care, because it is so remote from our day-to-day lives, seemingly, though not actually. I'll talk a little bit about the current issues that are going on, because there's so much movement just as we're coming out of the COVID spending, hopefully not having to return to that, fingers crossed, and moving into this big infrastructure agenda. And then I'm going to link this to what my new passion is. I think I must be a professional worrier, because I worry so much about the debt. I have ever since I started in this area in my 20s. But I now worry about it not because it's such a problem in and of itself, which it is, but because it's also this underlying problem to all these other big problems we face on the horizon in terms of the geopolitical stage and new kinds of risks and natural disasters. And to go into those so indebted is incredibly dangerous. But the big issue I see is the fact that we are so polarized as a country, so divided, so distrustful of each other, that we can't seem to make progress on any issues, least of all something that's hard, like the national debt. And not being able to do that makes us so weak for these other positions. So actually, one Friday night, not so many weeks ago, I sat at home alone in a very, very lonely, pathetic way. And I wrote up what I saw as the national threat pyramid, where there was just a whole sequence of different risks that we're facing. And so I'll try to be as uplifting as I can in this discussion, but I will tell you, I come from a very dark place, because I think we know well about a lot of the threats we as a country are facing, but we don't seem equipped to actually just kind of roll up our sleeves and come together enough to face them. And so that's where I sit, seeing the debt as a big hurdle to the other issues that are out there. So let me start at the beginning. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, both kind of a laugh line of a name of an organization. I didn't name it. I was the second person to run it, but both suffers from the problem that people always forget the name all the time. We have some blooper reel somewhere of lots of famous people quoting us or referring to us, but butchering our name, but also one that is so clearly not succeeding, right? We do not have a responsible federal budget. In fact, we barely have a budget most years. And so it is a mission that I was really drawn to out of the blue. I worked at the Brookings Institution. I worked on Wall Street. I was watching markets, and I suddenly became really interested in how markets in New York were so out of touch with what was going on in Washington, D.C. And I read a report by the Congressional Budget Office, the greatest independent agency that writes about the numbers. And it was like a mystery novel I could not put down. It was so good. It was so fairly written, which really appealed to me, because I'm a diehard political independent. I'll talk a little bit about that and the role of the parties in all of this. And it was very fair and unbiased. And I think it's so critical that we retain the strength of our nonpartisan, unbiased institutions now more than ever. But this Congressional Budget Office report I found captivating, and I couldn't figure out why we were borrowing so much money when there didn't seem to be an economic reason for it. I wanted to go read like a Deficit for Dummies book. It didn't exist, so I wrote one, only to find out that once you write a book, you're actually supposed to have an agent and a publisher first, not afterwards. But after contacting, I think, 100 agents to the last number, I got an agent. We were gonna publish the Deficit for Dummies book. Ross Perot loved it. We were gonna go to book tour, and then they balanced the budget. So that was the end of my book career. There was no need for the book. And I was thrilled that we balanced the budget, but it didn't deal with the long-term problems, and it didn't deal with the problems that have come back in full force. So I moved into running this organization, which was tiny at the time. And just to explain what we do. So it's nonpartisan. The board of directors are people who've been in government before, running the Treasury, the Fed, the budget committees, OMB, CBO. Our co-chairs are Mitch Daniels, Tim Penny, former congressman from Minnesota, and Leon Panetta. And so it's really kind of the who's who of budget world that helps us not be pie in the sky, like throw out crazy ideas, but instead try to work within the system. So to come up with ideas that would improve the fiscal situation that are also realistic. which these days are like none. There's only trying to do less damage. There doesn't seem to be much progress in making things better. But we work in 4 areas. First is on policy. We write policy explanations, decipher things, make apples to apples comparisons because the numbers can be so confusing, come out with solutions, ideas, recommendations. The second thing we do is we work with members on Capitol Hill. I do think one of our strengths is that we really are trusted as a bipartisan organization. Often that means both sides are hating us equally. But hopefully it also means that we can bring some trust and do some bridge building. And I do a lot of that. I bring members of Congress together as often as I can to have discussions about big policy issues. Everything on the budget. I also, though, run a dinner series for members of Congress on technology, the economy, and capitalism, so that they can take time out of their busy days, take a step back and think about some of these bigger issues. The third thing is communications. We always try to have earned media, being on television, being in the paper, kind of putting out fact checks on different things so that you can reach a broader audience. And the fourth area is engagement, where we do have state chapters. They are in about half the states, I would say. A lot of people who've kind of taken this effort on and worked with us to partner with us. Members of Congress never, ever hear from anyone that they care about fiscal policy, that they care about the budget. So one call on the budget deficit is notable because it goes against the 10,000 calls on give me this or give me this. So there's actually some real power in that grassroots thing. And we also have engagement. We'll reach out to, could all the former heads of OMB write a letter on the tax gap or, pick your topic. So all sorts of things like that. That is who we are, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Now let me jump in. The main thing is it's not hard to, it's sort of the state of the nation, the state of the fiscal nation is really, really bad. And I'll just start by explaining when people say, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, what is fiscal responsibility? It is not needing to balance your budget every year. It is not a balanced budget amendment, which in many ways is an excuse for not putting the policies in place. It is the principle that we should be borrowing for economic reasons. And there are many times where we should be borrowing. We have just come out of kind of the poster child for why you need to borrow, this huge COVID recession. But so often we are borrowing not for economic reasons, but for political reasons, because it is the expedient, easy thing to do. And we are therefore just raking up trillions and trillions of debt because it is too difficult to go through the most basic principle of budgeting, which is something worth doing? And one of the tests of that is it worth paying for? So where we are right now is our debt is just above 100% of GDP. The historical average in this country has been 40% of GDP. That's where we were when we went into the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. That's where we were for the bulk of our history. So we are at much, much higher levels at 100% of GDP. I know someone will ask me this and they'll say, when is the debt too high? There is no magic number. The issue is we can borrow as long as people will let us borrow. But the higher it is, the more likely we will find out where that invisible fence is of the limit. And that becomes a more painful scenario than where we are right now. But so the debt's at about 100% of GDP. Interest payments, about the fastest growing part of our federal budget. And as I said, we are quickly approaching, so we're well above the historical average. We are quickly approaching the historical record, which is 106% of GDP. That happened right after World War II. And of course, we'd fought a world war. That's why we were there. And over the next 4 or 5 years, we brought that debt back down incredibly quickly through economic growth and near balanced budgets for many years. So the problem is not just where we are at near record levels, it's where we're heading. And if we do nothing else right now built into our budget, we are on track to borrow another $12 or $13 trillion over the next decade. And in budget speak, we always talk in 10 years. So that means the debt will be heading up, to that record, to 106 to 110% of GDP, and eclipsing it if a number of likely things happen. The thing that's most likely is there's a bunch of tax cuts that were passed. You'll remember before COVID, they are expiring. One truism, nothing ever expires. Once you build something into the budget, it's incredibly difficult to pull it back out. So when you're passing it, you say it will be temporary, we'll reconsider it, we'll pay for the rest of it later. That basically never happens. So with the expiration headed our way, there's likely to be a lot more borrowing on top of that. The other issue that's coming up in the next 10 years is we have 4 major trust funds headed for expiration: Social Security Retirement, Social Security Disability, the Highway Trust Fund, and Medicare Part A. These trust funds are mechanisms that show us how much dedicated revenue is going in to fund the programs. And unconscionable that we know, particularly in Social Security and Medicare, that these programs have made huge promises that they will pay for, where the money to pay for them does not exist. I actually, about 1 million years ago, wrote my master's thesis in graduate school on how to fix the Social Security Trust Fund. And it was pretty cool. I did this whole Excel spreadsheet where you could pick your own way of doing it, come up with your own model. We now actually use that as a template for one of the many. We have a lot of interactive tools, which if anybody's interested in the budget, please go play with them. We have a debt fixer where you can figure out how you'd fix the debt on your own, a Social Security one to fix that, which actually a lot of members of Congress have used to come up with their own plans and Social Security fixes. A bunch of new cool tools called Budgeting for the Future, which looks at how the budget treats different generations. More or Less, which asks you on a dollar amount per individual, whether you think we should spend more or less on each of the programs, like defense costs X a year per person, how much we spend, and how would you pay for things. There's just a lot of tools. I think they're educational, but I also think they're kind of a neat idea to test crowdsourcing, to really see what people think about the budget, to weigh in on where you think the national priority should be. I'll give you my favorite stat. We spend $6 on the federal budget per senior on every one we spend on children. Now, some people will think that's right. I do not. One of the things about our group is we don't have that many opinions. We sort of like, it's whatever people think is right for the budget is what we should do. It's just that you shouldn't borrow unnecessarily to do it. But there's some things that I do think are wrong. And one of them is we have been underinvesting, particularly in human capital and in children for many decades now. And I think that's going to have dangerous effects on the long-term health of the country. So it's sort of a focus on the long-term strength economically, both for fiscal reasons and public investment reasons. But again, I do think that's important about our organization. We don't tell you what you should think about the budget. You might be big government, expand all these programs. You might be small government, much smaller than it is, cut programs. I have pretty little tolerance for small government and therefore sign a no new taxes pledge, because if what you want is small government, you should cut spending. It's not that you should object to raising taxes and actually paying for the spending that's already on the books. But anybody who's kind of consistent with their principles, there's no right or wrong in the budget in terms of what we think, how we should be spending money and how much. But I do think there's a right or wrong in saying, these are all the things I want to spend money on, but I don't want to pay for them. So the going forward, we have the debt growing as a share of GDP. We have the interest payments being the fastest growing part of the budget. They're going to be about $1 trillion a year at the end of the decade, one of the biggest programs there is. We have all these trust funds that are coming under real strain and will not be able to pay full benefits. And it's really unconscionable to particularly people who depend on the programs, that if you don't fix Social Security, there's automatic 23% across the board benefit cuts that happen as soon as the trust funds don't have enough money. That's for a 95-year-old widow, the same as it is for Bill Gates. And instead of Congress knowing that there's a problem, knowing they need to fix it, hashing out the differences, they continue to ignore it every year. And that's been going on for decades. So the picture is bleak, right? There's nothing encouraging about the fiscal path of our country. There's nothing sustainable about it. If your debt is growing faster than your economy, that's a signal that you have a problem. And that is a situation where we are. And if your interest is growing faster in the budget than your revenue coming in, you are also in trouble. So every kind of red light warning sign is out there blinking at us. So why does it matter? And there's a bunch of reasons. The first one's economic, that if your debt is too high, you're pushing down your GDP growth. You're crowding out capital, even when interest rates, I know interest rates are like so low, they're negative, but it's actually still crowding out public investment. For every dollar of borrowing, there's a third of that, 33 cents less in private investment. Sorry, crowding out private investment. That dampens growth. Not as big a problem as it has been right now because there's an abundance of capital, but it is a weakness, and it is likely already slowing the growth of our economy. And that translates into slowing wage growth and standard of living. Particularly an issue when you borrow as much as we do from abroad. We borrow about 40% from abroad. Two biggest lenders are Japan and China. China owns $1 trillion US treasuries. We'll talk about that more, I'm guessing. But that means that you pay those interest payments back out of your economy. That's why the standard of living doesn't grow as quickly. One of the main reasons you care about a healthy balance sheet is because when emergencies come, you do need to borrow. And so when we go through something like COVID, I'll have journalists calling all the time saying, oh, you run the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. You must be furious that we're borrowing all this money. Absolutely not. I mean, I was terrified because there was a global pandemic, just like all of us were. I was terrified because we had to shut down the economy. But I was not at all upset that we were borrowing. I was thrilled that we were able to. But it's not a guarantee that you can borrow at rates staying low. And so one of the reasons that you want to make sure your fiscal balance sheet is healthy is so that when these emergencies come along, whether it's war, whether it's national disaster, whether it's pandemics, you are able to borrow to prop up the economy and fill in the difference between your potential GDP and your actual GDP, to fill in the gap in the overall economy. It's not just borrowing money because these things are important. Otherwise, everybody'd say, well, this is important, you know, pre-K is important, tax cuts are important, defense is important. They're all important. But when you have a downturn like we had, it's important that you're actually borrowing the money to fill in the gap in your health of your economy. And we were able to do that remarkably successfully. I would have to give A+ for the response to COVID, and we can talk about that too. I do think the final bill was too big, poorly targeted, didn't get updated as the economy was improving, should have been much different than it was. But prior to that, all of the COVID borrowing bills were really effective and saved the economy. So you worry about debt's effect on economic growth. You worry about your ability to borrow in emergencies. And we know there will be more. And sadly, it feels like there will be more coming more often. The third thing is I think the amount of borrowing we have has really hindered us because it is a moment for big thinking and big reforms, I believe. And the example I would give is I think we need to massively overhaul our social contract. Right now, like I said, $6 go to seniors for one on children. We have all of our spending basically focused, not all, obviously, but a huge bulk, about 50% of our spending focused on retirement and healthcare. But those aren't the huge challenges of the century we're in. They're the huge challenges of the last century. And what we need to be thinking about is how you work in a massively dynamic global economy where industries are disappearing, where technology displacement is happening all the time, where wage growth is not guaranteed the way it used to be, whether you change industries. Or my big prediction that one of the big trends we'll see soon is that 40, 50, 60-year-olds, their wages don't keep going up through the lifetime like we used to assume they would, because young people are so much more tied to the most current technologies. So you're going to see all these beliefs about how the economy would work through a lifetime and the general social contract turned on their head. And we are not doing anything to think about how to update this social contract. I think sort of the most obvious example is we need lifelong learning. There is no way that you are finished developing your skills at 18 or 22 or even 26, 29, you know, even if you've gotten your third PhD, you still need to be updating your skills throughout your work life. And I was just thinking, gosh, I've barely gone, I mean, I go to conferences, I go learn new things on panels, but I haven't gone back to school in anything. And clearly we all need to do that to stay current in our jobs. So those are the kinds of things that by being so in debt, I don't think we're doing justice to the problems of the moment. And then there's, of course, the geopolitical vulnerabilities, which we have. And that is becoming a more clear threat that I think we were kind of blind to for a while. We are not at all guaranteed to be the economic superpower for much longer. I think we may already not be in some ways. Obviously, we are on per capita GDP or, you know, strength of the economy, but not if you look at the trajectory. And there is no way to be heavily indebted and go into moments of high competition with strength. And I guess related to that, I would say, I think we are only waking up to the kinds of attacks and assaults that are going on, sort of the quiet stealth cyber war that we are in the midst of and horribly unprepared for, and not at all thinking about how we use those resources in our budget to match the new priorities of the new threats at the moment. I told you I'm glum. Oh my gosh, I hope people have cocktails out there and have started having drinks. I know I'm a downer. So let me turn to my next downer of a topic. But let me go to what's currently going on, which actually shouldn't be a downer. I think, again, this is a preference, not an impartial evaluation. I'm really pleased that the current agenda is looking at really moving more towards investment. Our budget focuses on consumption, about 84% to only about 16% of investment. We need to be rethinking how we invest in our budget. The focus is mainly on infrastructure. Like I said, my biggest focus is human capital. You need some of both, you need some of all. But you'll notice we're just talking about expanding the budget, not shifting resources. It is very easy to do things that are giving away. It is much harder to pay for. And to the massive credit of the administration, they have said they want to pay for the Build Back Better plan, for the two parts of it, the bipartisan infrastructure deal and the bigger, broader deal that's going to move through reconciliation, or the budget process that is a fast track process. That said, this is where I go back to glum. So I'm excited those are priorities. I'm thrilled they've said they want to pay for it. They have put some pay fors out there, but there's a lot of budget gimmickry in the discussion that's going on right now. And so the infrastructure bill that we're going to be talking about this week, about $550, $600 billion, probably about 200 to 300 billion is actually paid for. The rest of it is fake. So that's going to add to the debt. The next round that's going to go through reconciliation, from what we're hearing, about a quote unquote $3.5 trillion bill. But a lot of those offsets are fake as well, about another 500 billion. And there's the age-old gimmick of pretending a lot of policies are going to expire. Now, the details of this bill aren't out yet. We don't know what's actually in it, but some of the directions the committees have been, expirations will be dependent on the scores and costs of these policies, meaning it will run for as many years as you can to fit in a $3.5 trillion package, but then it expires, knowing full well that you're likely to extend it later. The real cost of this bill is about 5 trillion, 5.5 trillion. If you add that to the first bill, that's actually larger than what Bernie Sanders was asking for. So we are not talking about modest compromises here. We are talking about big expansionary spending, most of the pay-fors, which are not real, and putting this all in place before we address the existing national debt that is on track to grow for $13 trillion. And if you add this, probably another 6 or 7 trillion. So we're talking about $20 trillion in new debt over the next decade, quite plausibly. That'll bring debt up to about 125% of GDP. So it's really hard. I mean, politics enters into all of this. You're going to have Democrats saying, well, why shouldn't we borrow for this? The Republicans didn't pay for their tax cuts, and it's going to be this, you did this, well, you should do this. And I understand the political tensions, and I also think they're very damaging to our country. I think if two teams are constantly looking at how they can one-up each other instead of where they can compromise and cooperate, you're going to have very fiscally irresponsible policies, because the best thing you can do is borrow, ask someone else to pay for it. So that gets me kind of to this issue of polarization. What it would take, and I do look forward to talking to more of these details. I just want to kind of give the broad overview here. But what it would take to deal with these issues is first focusing on policy, not politics. Just take Social Security. Like I used to say it was the third rail, but it turns out everything's the third rail. Kind of any policy you talk about is the third rail. But Social Security reform, which is just a no-brainer that we have to do it, there should be literally no disagreement on the fact that we have to fix Social Security. Where the disagreement should be is on how. Do you want to do it on tax increases, lifting the payroll tax rate or cap? Do you want to do it on spending reductions, means testing benefits, or across the board reductions, which I would not want to do, but slowing the growth of benefits for higher income people, perhaps? Do you want to raise the retirement age? We can disagree on the how, but you can't disagree on the fact that before I reach retirement, the program will not be able to pay full benefits. This is not way out on the horizon. This is coming into effect relatively soon. And yet Congress finds it more beneficial to avoid the hard choices of fixing it and to keep this issue alive. So you can club the other party over the head with threats that they want to touch Social Security. Anyone who talks responsibly about this, like, oh, when Social Security started, retirement age was 65, life expectancy was 62. Today, retirement age is just gradually moving to 67. Life expectancy is well into the 70s and 80s. Should we talk about raising the retirement age? Okay, by the time I'm done saying that, the attack ad has been written and is very effectively killing me. So no politician can talk about this unilaterally, single-handedly. And yet we just don't have the environment at all where politicians say, we're going to favor policy over politics, which is the first thing you need to do. The second is you've got to be willing to look at the long term, not the short term. And we're doing the opposite. So much of our budgeting, and I say budgeting quite loosely, we just barely budget anymore. We are going through all the exercises this year without even having tried to pass a budget yet. It was due April 15th. There's no budget in place. And we're having a discussion about spending and borrowing trillions of dollars. Just imagine that if you run a company, how that would go over. But if you are focusing on the long term instead of the short term, that is also the second piece that you really need to do to deal with fiscal responsibility. After that, you have to be willing to make tough choices. Tell me the last time a politician told us to do anything difficult. No one asks anything of us. They just give away things, right? So budgeting requires tough choices and it requires compromise, which not that long ago was a good word, but in a lot of political circles now is actually considered a bad word. It seems compromising on your principles instead of recognizing that we live in a diverse democracy with lots of different opinions and preferences. And that in order to run our fiscal situation and our budget and allocate our trillions of dollars of resources, we need to compromise to reflect all of those different views. So those kind of four criteria of policy, long-term trade-offs, hard choices, trade-offs / hard choices, and compromise are, I think, exactly the things that you need to fix the situation. We know the policies, but that's kind of the ingredients that would make it work. But those are exactly the things we don't have, and that our division and our distrust and our dysfunction are making it harder and harder to see how we're going to get back to that place. So on that cheery note, I think I'll stop. And I look forward to hearing how people think we could, in fact, fix those challenges or anything else people want to talk about.
Yes, thank you, Maya. It's a tough topic, but we appreciate you keeping at the forefront and have us focused on these, like I said, important topics and important issues. We have a number of questions from the audience, and I guess one way to frame a couple of them might be the vulnerabilities that you mentioned, especially geopolitically, China, for example, given the amount of treasuries that they own, the amount of debt that they own, are there ways that they could manipulate our economy, manipulate our system doing that? And would that then in turn, I guess, unite us to face some of these tough choices and, cause us to reevaluate where we are?
Yeah. So the answer to the first part of that is absolutely there are things they can do. They own $1 trillion of treasuries, and merely suggesting that they're not interested in purchasing treasuries. They have been slowing their growth of treasuries, but not purchasing them, not renewing them, or in fact, dumping some of them can terrify our markets and markets around the world. And we've seen this happen. I remember during the tariff fight, thinking, I wrote an op-ed on this, in fact, saying, we are acting as though we are setting the rules for this trade dispute, that we are only going to fight about it through tariffs. Soybeans are not the only weapon in the toolbox here. One country owns $1 trillion of treasuries of the other. And the conventional wisdom is, well, they would never dump treasuries because it would actually hurt China more than it would hurt the US. But for anyone who's paying attention, China's playing a long game. The US is not. And we have very different kind of pain threshold for what we're willing to put our own population through to get an upper hand. And it's only becoming, clear in the past couple of years just how unaligned the two nations are in terms of our economic and our geopolitical aspirations. So yes, they certainly could threaten the US. And I think people believe that China could be unifying. And I think it could and should be. I would have said the same thing about a pandemic. I think a lot of us might have thought that would also be unifying, or 9/11, or a lot of things that have come along. And it now seems like, because the way our politics work, and it's just such a shift in that the more extreme you are, the more airtime you are. I thought about, it's not so true right now, but year ago, there were only two people who really had platforms, and that was Donald Trump and AOC. And it's really kind of the influencer for any of you who have kids and are trying to get them off TikTok and try to figure out why they want to watch the Kardashians, all the things I am struggling with right now. It's like this influencer economy isn't just silly, stuff your teenagers are doing. It is affecting how politics work. It is affecting how most of our systems work. And so the problem is that the things that used to unify us also mean that if you're united, you're not getting as much airtime. And you now, instead of having sort of two parties that know when they need to work together, you have all these little political islands of people who are looking for the megaphone on different things, and usually being extreme and taking a different position, particularly in the midst of disinformation campaigns that are being lodged against us and rather effective. It is very difficult to unify around anything. My hope is yes. I would have thought that would have started a few years ago. There is some sign it is. The China caucus, the China efforts in Congress are some of the more mature, sophisticated efforts going on. It is certainly a issue that you can use to unify the country. It kind of saddens me deeply because we are writing a paper. We have a project called Fix Us, which is a side project looking at how you do deal with division, dysfunction, distrust. And I have written, and we're going to write a big paper on this, like, where are the national aspirations and ambitions? I once hosted a dinner and the CEO of Pepsi said, this country has lost its swagger. And I just thought that was beautiful. We had lost our swagger. What are the things we could do to get it back? What is our modern day moonshot? But the Olympics is something, and I think it feels good watching it, but it's just not big enough for the moment to really unify us, for sure. I think it's terrifying when the only thing that has a chance of unifying is an external threat, and basically some form of war, whether it's economic or cyber, or, there's a lot of different things going on in China right now. But I think nonetheless, that may be where we are, where it's the most likely thing to unify us, but I'm not optimistic it will, because I think it's kind of a prisoner's dilemma with Congress. The public good is Congress acting together, but the individual good, a lot of times members of Congress see as going their own lone wolf way. And that's a new model we haven't seen much, and we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah, just following up on your comment about the pandemic and how well that provided life support to the economy, has that, in your mind, was that just a one-off, what we've done financially and fiscally the past 18 months? Or is this the new normal where anytime there's economic pain, a downturn, or bad things happen, we will be, as a government, much more aggressive fiscally, and will recessions be shorter and quicker and less painful? Is that the new normal?
So it can't be the new normal for too long is the issue. Yes, you can always unify around borrowing. The easiest thing for members of Congress to do is borrow. The easiest thing for members of Congress to do is to give lip service about how they oppose borrowing while simultaneously borrowing. I'm not sure how many people noticed, but the debt ceiling, we hit the debt ceiling limit on Saturday, right? Not a single discussion about lifting it, which is obvious. We can't default. And here we are, what we're doing is juggling trust funds right now to avoid default. Yet the last 3 times we lifted the debt ceiling, along with lifting the debt ceiling, we implemented legislation that borrowed more. So 3 times ago, it was we were going to borrow $75 billion. 2 times ago, it was $400 billion while lifting the debt ceiling. And most recent time, we borrowed $1.7 trillion while lifting the debt ceiling, because there was bipartisan willingness to bump up spending in a variety of different places. So it is relatively easy to get some cooperation if you're not paying for things, if you are borrowing money. That said, I think this was unique. We slammed the economy shut. We had to build into the economy, and it was a global situation where there was no help, no lifeline anywhere. I don't think that will be the new normal. And if it is, we'll run out of the capacity to borrow sooner than we otherwise will. You can't borrow indefinitely. Markets are going to start looking for different places to park their assets. The more politically unstable and fiscally unstable we look, the less we're going to be able to borrow, less runway we have to borrow at such cheap rates. It's why the IMF has warned us that while most countries can weather the pandemic, they borrowed a chunk of money, but they'll go back to stable debts. The US is the only one they're issuing warnings about where we need to bring our debt down because the trajectory is so unstable. What I do think there will be as a lasting effect is the kinds of cash payments that President Trump wanted and the Democrats have wanted. There's kind of a rallying around the notion that people really like getting money. And the more we can find ways to give people money, the more popular it is. And I'll tell you another way that I'm actually open to as well, but I think kind of goes into that. It's not really bribery, but it feels a little bit like it's bribing the political support. But I think if you're talking about a carbon tax, which I would put at the top of the list of sensible policies, you still have distribution challenges. So one of the ways you could go around that is create a new carbon tax, but have some kind of dividend that goes to families making under $100,000 or $200,000, or for everybody, if you want to do some kind of a rebate, and giving that money because of sort of behavioral economics. I would rather get a check, even if it's less money than I'm paying in the less clear, transparent taxes. That check will make me happier. So we know you can create a lot of political loyalty from sending money directly. So I think that will be one of the lasting legacies of how COVID worked. And yes, I think if the economy gets slammed shut again, trillions is the new billions. We will be borrowing in massive amounts that we never could have thought of before. But, and this is where it gets scary. This debt load is so huge right now that if our interest rates go up by 1 percentage point, we will then be paying $300 billion more a year in interest payments. That's double what we're paying now. 1 percentage point doubles our interest payments, which are already the fastest growing part of the budget. So you'll be talking about multiple trillions, where we will take more than all of our income tax revenue just to cover interest payments if rates go up. So the more you borrow, even when interest rates are low, which doesn't mean something's free, it just means you're pushing the paying of it to later, but there's not as much cost for waiting, but you're still making someone else pay for it. But the more you borrow, when those interest rates do go up, the faster the pain or the kind of budget vice will kick in. And so that's what I'm really worried about, is sort of this feeling of this money spigot. And there's lots of arguments out there. Don't worry, you should borrow as much as you want. We print our own currency. We can always print more. Seems like final last words before hyperinflation hits an economy. Ours is unique. It won't happen as quickly as it would in other countries that didn't borrow in their own currency, but there's real risks with that approach. And so while not predicting the future, I will certainly predict that I think polarization gets worse before it gets better. And I think more polarization leads to more borrowing, and that hastens the time where you really start to see the pain of growing interest rates or loss of your currency in the global economy, the role that we have now.
Yeah, and to that last point about, we control our monetary policy, we print our own money, we can, keep rates low for now. We have a lot of questions about, well, and I know you mentioned a number of things we should worry about, vulnerabilities geopolitically and economic growth and wage growth and all that. But it seems like to our audience that kind of the one big risk is inflation, and so far it's been labeled temporary. It's unclear how temporary that is. But if it's benign and we return to kind of a low rate of inflation, do we have a little bit more flexibility, or when is that breaking point to when we get that hyperinflation risk starting to rear its head?
Well, I feel much better saying I have no idea, because I just came back from a fabulous conference. I'm a member of the Aspen Economic Security Project, and we just came back from having lots of discussions I just outed myself since I just came back from Aspen. I can't really complain about not being there in person, because I did get to see beautiful Colorado. But we had lots of phenomenal panels about inflation. And it literally was the kind of thing where I nodded with every single thing that every person said about whether it was a transitory situation or it was going to be longer lasting. And we have no idea. Right. So the reason that we have inflation right now is because, yes, we borrowed a ton to get through COVID, but really what happened was that by borrowing that much, sorry, my lighting seems to be shifting. The sun is going down. By borrowing so much, so many people were able to bring down their own balance sheets and save a lot more, and they had a lot of pent up demand. And we really did, of course, there were terrible, terrible hardships. I in no way mean to minimize that. But we did, and by we, I mean they, did a really good job of alleviating what would have been tremendous economic hardship. And most people, some ironically, ended up making more during COVID, having more income, disposable income, than they did beforehand. Save that. So there's a ton of pent up demand now. And so there's debates like, well, you didn't go out to dinner for a year. You're not going to suddenly go out to dinner twice a week instead of once a week, if that's what you used to do. On the other hand, you might start going to more expensive restaurants. So we don't know how much of that inflation will be catching up. We don't know how much of it is like, okay, I've got some in my savings account. I will buy a car. I will go on a fancy vacation. But those combined things with the huge supply chain challenges that we're seeing because of this demand and the inability to meet it, and the new concerns about kind of the dependency and the loss of economic resilience that we've seen throughout this with supply chains, we don't know how long that lasts. And the real question is, even if it is kind of transitory, does it start to get priced in? If I think it's going to last 3 years, I'm going to buy my dishwasher and my car and my dining room chandelier today instead of waiting. And if I don't think so, then I won't be in such a rush. But so it is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so it's the psychological piece of all this that nobody can know how that's going to play out. I am still in the relatively sanguine. Like, I do not think that this is about to burst open into huge hyperinflation. I think in a global economy, we're more able to move around things. But I think it's going to last for a while. And some people will think that's okay because you will inflate our way out of the debt to some extent, but it is a hidden and nasty tax that particularly hits low-income people disproportionately. And so I really worry about kind of being too relaxed about the effects of inflation. And of course, it is one of those things that if you get behind, it's very hard to catch up and fix it. But the bottom line is, I just said a lot while not saying what's going to happen because I have no idea. And I am in good company after listening to all sorts of heads of different Fed banks and different experts on it, all really trying to work through the data with no clear picture of how much we should be worried right now. I do think the wage inflation that's going on, which obviously can harm businesses and show up as inflation in the economy, I think it's terrific. I think wage inflation is what we've needed at the low income for a long time, and that it's, it might be hard to hire when you have to raise prices at the low end. But if you're somebody who's been worried about income inequality and economic mobility, that's a good thing. And so from where I sit, while it obviously leads to higher prices and other things, that's a trade-off I would take. So there are some benefits at this point in the chain where we are.
Got it. And then another theme from audience questions is, we have to make tough choices. Some of these trust funds and some of the, mandatory programs that you mentioned, Social Security, Medicare, if there's less of an appetite socially to change those, is taxes an option? You mentioned the carbon tax. Our audience is asking about wealth taxes, more progressive personal tax rates. I guess there's talk about corporate tax rate changes globally, not just in the US, but your thoughts on if that might be an avenue to, maybe shore up some of the debt issues that we're facing.
100%. There's literally no way we're going to address the fiscal problems we are facing without revenues, new taxes, and they're going to be significant. Anybody who kind of knows these numbers is super annoyed that the president has promised not to raise taxes on people below 400,000, not because it's not a smart political promise, but because it's implausible, particularly with the kinds of spending increases that he wants to put out there. The willingness to cut spending is really small. So I guess the first point I'd make is, no matter what, if you're serious about getting the fiscal situation under control, and if you want to add to that a new investment agenda or agenda for anything else, new national security agenda, you are going to need to both cut spending and raise taxes. The reality is we let the window slide of reforming our big entitlement programs when the baby boomers were starting to retire. That means since politicians are unwilling to change benefits for people who are already in retirement, that a greater share of this will come out of taxes than spending cuts. And so I don't say this with a preference, but my belief is that whatever deals we have, we'll end up having about $3 in tax increases for everyone in spending cuts. People will talk about it differently. No matter what party, people will pretend they want to cut spending more than raising taxes because it's a little bit more politically palatable, but in the end, they won't. There's a constituency for every spending program. And it's really hard to, even the most outdated or unnecessary or poorly targeted programs, it's really hard to scale them back. So when it comes to revenues, what makes sense? Yeah, I think the carbon tax makes a ton of sense. I think that Joe Biden President Biden will repeal some of the corporate rate cut. I think it will go from 21 to 25%. Some of the high earners, probably taxes on capital gains will go up. I think he'll use a lot of those things, but not to fix the debt problem at all, but to pay for his new spending agenda. I do think the sequencing thing is wrong here. We should put in place measures to deal with Social Security, Medicare, and our unsustainable debt first. Get that figured out. It can be phased in gradually, but figure out how you're going to do that, and then talk about new things to spend money on and how to pay for them. I'm very worried about doing that first because it uses up all of your pay force. But I think you'll do the corporate tax, individual tax, capital gains there. Wealth tax, don't think so, but it might. I think it's just too controversial to move. It's not to say that it's a good or bad thing. I think it's too one-sided to have sufficient support right now. What you could do, the one other part that's a lot of revenue, is we have so many tax deductions, credits, exemptions, exclusions. We lose almost $1.5 trillion per year in taxes that are, because we have like a tax code that's Swiss cheese. And so you could massively reform that. Marty Feldstein, who passed away now, great economist, and I wrote a paper together where we suggested you just limit how many tax breaks as an individual you can take as a share of your economy. I mean, of your income, excuse me. So that you couldn't take more tax breaks than X percent of your earnings that year. And you could raise trillions of doing that. I mean, ideally you'd actually go after them one-on-one, but they're also popular. Like home mortgage interest deduction it's a terrible policy. It's a terrible policy where money flows to the lenders and the builders and the realtors, and it drives up home prices in a way that actually makes it less affordable for first-time home buyers, which is ostensibly the reason to have the policy. So it's bad economics. A lot of these tax breaks are, they pay you to do what you would do anyhow. I would have bought a house anyhow, but as it is, I've got, young people who are renters subsidizing my home. But as bad as this policy is, if you say this one, I'm sure right now people are throwing bread rolls at their Zoom screen because we love the home mortgage interest deduction. It is the thing that when we pay our taxes make us the happiest, that we can see we're getting a tax break there. So it's very difficult to reform those individually, which is why I thought maybe a broad haircut of them might be a lot easier to get done than saying, we're going to get rid of the healthcare exclusion, we're going to get rid of this credit, et cetera. But there is a lot of revenue there. But the bottom line is anyone who tells you taxes aren't going to go up is not telling the truth. They might not have realized it if they're a politician yet, because some of them believe their own talking points, but there's no way. And the debt fixer is a really interesting way to see this visibly on your own, but go try to figure out how you get the debt from 100% of GDP down to 80 or 60 or whatever you pick. And you'll see just how hard it is to do without significant revenue increases.
Yeah, and then everything you're saying, you're mentioning and talking about, Maya, sounds completely logical. And we have a number of questions of basically why is this such a partisan issue, and some of the common ground that you mentioned that we could find. I mean, are there any 2 or 3 points that we could really find that this just makes sense that we should do? And a second follow up to that is this whole debt ceiling game of chicken we play. Can we just find a different way to do it?
Yeah.
Why does that happen?
Okay, those are 2 good questions to put together, because the answer is budget process and reform. And if you thought the budget sounded boring, I mean, I can't tell you, when I tell people what I do, they're like, oh, they slowly back away. Like, this is the most boring thing. It's really not. The more you get into it, the more interesting it is. But budget process really sounds boring. I promise you, it's actually not. And that's where a lot of the solutions are. So the debt ceiling has outlived its usefulness. However, it is one of the only kind of constraints we still have in the budget. When you pass a budget, and I should say, if you pass a budget, once in a while when they pass a budget, there's no metric that limits how much you borrow in the budget. You can borrow infinity. So the debt ceiling is one of the only things in there that puts a limit on. So I think it's important that when we reform it, so that it not be held hostage and people talk about defaulting, which is obviously holding a gun to your own head. It's terribly reckless. We replace it with another kind of constraint. There's a really good idea out there of replacing it with debt targets, so that in the budget, you would then say, okay, our debt to GDP is 101% of GDP. We want over the next 10 years to bring it down to 92%. And assuming that the budget meets that requirement, the debt ceiling's gone. If it doesn't, the president's going to have to unilaterally lift it, but also offer a plan to meet those debt targets. Something like that, which forces the trade-off discussion, would be much better than the debt ceiling. And that's the answer as well to that question of, wait, this seems so sensible. Can't we just like do some common sense things? And boy, do I wish we could. I feel like there are a lot of people who want to do this. And I feel like as the parties become more extreme and dominated by political drive instead of, you know, the policy compromise, it's alienating more and more of us. And we would like to find a way where we could work together more often. We have a group of members in the House, the 30 and 30 group that we've built of 30 Republicans, 30 Democrats who are trying to work on compromises on these things. And there's a great group of problem solvers that works on this, not just on fiscal issues, but on all sorts of issues. So we're trying to do that. But I think the trick for the budget is put a process in place so that members can say, oh, I didn't have a choice. I had to pay as you go, which is actually something that's in place, but routinely ignored. So there should be a rule that if your debt is over 60% of GDP, you can't borrow money for new policies unless it's a nationally declared emergency. Or for every dollar you pay for something new, you also have to contribute $1 to reducing the debt. That's a double pay-go, as I call it. Another example, one that I love, is there's legislation out there that's co-sponsored. It's bipartisan and bicameral, co-sponsored by Mitt Romney, Joe Manchin, and a bunch of folks in the House. Ed Case, Mike Gallagher, Scott Peters, a bunch of really responsible members came together. And it's like, if you look at who co-sponsors the Trust Act, it is kind of a signal of who's responsible on this issue and trying to work on it. But it basically says, it's so simple. It says, if there's a trust fund that it's headed towards insolvency in the next 15 years, we're going to appoint a group of lawmakers to try to fix it and make those recommendations. How can you object to that? It is in no way slanted towards taxes or spending or any outcome. It just says, we will have a group of people who do their job. You know who's out there opposing it? AARP. You know, it's really, really frustrating because they're very powerful groups which don't want any change. I honestly don't know why. I don't know how you can say you're reflecting the interests of senior citizens who have this program, many of whom depend on it, by not fixing it. But so to me, something that is, it has to be a level playing field. It can't be about dominating, like stacking the deck for the outcomes. It has to just be pushing choices and making those trade-offs have to be dealt with in the budget process. I think those are the things that would make it more likely that we could get some of these changes that anybody who's paying attention knows need to get done. I think that's how we would work them in.
That makes sense. And then we still do have a number of questions from the audience. I've got more questions, but I think given our time and we're approaching our 6:30 end, how about we conclude tonight's seminar? And just as Joella mentioned earlier today, for our friends who are joining us for the virtual dinner, that'll start in 15 minutes. And you can use the Zoom link that was emailed to you earlier today to log in for that. Just one note on that. In lieu of having the breakout rooms and in the hope of having more time for additional Q&A discussion, once we start at 6:45, we'll go right into group Q&A and not break into separate tables and come back. So we'll have 45 minutes for questions until 7:30 Mountain Time. And on that note, I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for attending, and most especially thank you to Maya MacGuineas for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.